A blizzard buried the Montana mountains before sunrise. In a lonely cabin, a Navy SEAL who trusted no one heard a wounded German shepherd clawing at his door. The dog looked like trouble, scarred, starving, and furious. But by morning, that same animal would drag him into the white darkness toward a sound no human should have heard. What waited below the snow was not just a rescue. It was a truth buried for 3 years. Before we begin, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from, and if you love heartwarming stories of courage, faith, and loyal animals, please subscribe to support our channel. The first winter storm came early to Montana's Bitterroot Valley, pressing gray clouds low over the pines and turning the lonely cabin into a dark wooden box beneath a sky full of warning. Luke Bennett had learned to trust warnings. At 34, he was still an active-duty Navy SEAL, though the man standing behind the cabin with an axe in his hands looked more like a ghost assigned to chop firewood until Judgment Day. He stood 6 feet 2, broad across the shoulders, lean from years of punishment disguised as training. His dark brown hair was cut short in the old military habit, his jaw square and usually clenched, his pale blue eyes calm in the way frozen lakes looked calm before they cracked. A short beard shadowed his face, not from style, but because shaving felt like one more conversation with a mirror he did not want to have. To strangers, Luke seemed controlled, almost cold. To the few men who had served beside him, he had once been steady, dry-humored, the kind of man who could make a joke about bad coffee while bullets chewed bark from the trees around him. But that version of him had been left somewhere overseas, buried under smoke, rotor wash, and a mission report nobody wanted to read twice. 2 weeks earlier, his commanding officer, Commander Daniel Hayes, a narrow-faced man in his late 40s with iron-gray hair, tired brown eyes, and the careful voice of someone used to ordering brave men into terrible places, had handed Luke the keys to this remote cabin. Hayes was not unkind. If anything, his kindness made the order harder to swallow. "Mandatory psychological leave," he had said, as if naming the wound could make it smaller. Luke had taken the keys without argument. SEALs obeyed orders, even the ones that felt like exile. Now he lived by routine because routine was the last fence between him and the memories. He woke at 400, before the sun touched the ridgelines. He ran 5 miles through snow that bit at his calves. He returned, ate plain oatmeal standing at the kitchen counter, cleaned the same rifle twice though it did not need cleaning once, then chopped wood until sweat cooled on his back and his left hand stopped trembling. He did not need so much wood. The cabin's covered porch was already stacked high with split oak, but labor had weight. Labor had shape. Labor did not scream in the dark. At night, sleep betrayed him. The helicopter always came first, the deep thudding blades rolling through his skull like a war drum from some ancient, merciless god. Then came the flash, the sand, the voice on the radio breaking into static, and Luke reaching for someone he could not save. He would wake on the floor, breathing like a hunted animal, one hand searching under the bed for a weapon that was no longer there. By morning, he would pretend the night had lost. The axe fell again. The log split cleanly, the crack echoing across the white yard. Luke paused. Something was wrong. The cabin sat in a clearing ringed by tall ponderosa pines, their branches heavy with fresh snow. Normally, the forest made small noises, birds, squirrels, wind shifting through needles. That morning, it held its breath. Luke lowered the axe and turned toward the front porch. Near the bottom step, the snow had been disturbed. Not by deer, not by fox. He walked closer and crouched, his breath pale in the cold. Paw prints, large ones. The pads were wide, the claws cut deep, and one side dragged oddly, as if the animal favored its right front leg. Luke studied the pattern with the stillness of a man reading a battlefield. The tracks circled the porch, paused near the kitchen window, crossed toward the back door, then returned to the tree line. It was not wandering. It was checking access points. A sick little laugh almost rose in his throat. Even the animals out here ran perimeter. He stood slowly, every muscle sharpening. His hunting knife hung at his belt, but he did not touch it. The old instinct whispered, "Threat." Another instinct, quieter but not dead, whispered, "Wounded." Luke stepped toward the trees. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The wind dropped, and the silence grew heavy enough to carry a heartbeat. Then a low growl rolled from the brush to his left. Luke stopped. The animal had flanked him. From beneath a fallen pine, two amber eyes burned through the shadows. A German shepherd stepped out, though it looked like the ruin of one. The dog was maybe 4 or 5 years old, large-framed but starved thin, with black and tan fur matted by sap, dirt, and dried blood. A jagged scar crossed its snout. Another bald, raw patch marked its left side. Its right front paw barely touched the ground. Yet the dog did not stagger forward like a desperate stray. It held position with terrible discipline, ears pinned, teeth bared, body angled to protect its blind side. Luke felt his own breath slow. This was no ordinary lost dog. This creature had learned pain, survived it, and come out guarding the gates of its own broken kingdom. "Easy," Luke said, voice low. The shepherd's growl deepened, but it did not charge. It stood exactly far enough away to strike or retreat, a scarred sentry in the snow, ready to fight the whole world if the world took one more step. Luke Bennett did not move when the German shepherd growled. In the white clearing behind the cabin, beneath the heavy-bellied sky of Montana's first winter storm, the two of them stood like opposing soldiers on a border neither had agreed to cross. The dog's teeth shone wet and sharp, its scarred snout wrinkled with warning. One wrong step, one raised hand, one breath too loud, and the animal would become a blade wrapped in fur. Luke understood that kind of fear. It was not cowardice. It was a fortress. He slowly lowered his gaze from the dog's amber eyes to the snow between them, letting the animal win the stare down without forcing it to fight for victory. "All right," he murmured, his voice rough from cold and too many silent mornings. "You keep your ground." The shepherd's ears stayed pinned back, but it did not lunge. That mattered. A truly feral animal might have vanished into the trees or attacked from panic. This one measured him, calculated him, hated him perhaps, but it was still thinking. Luke took one slow step backward. His boots dragged softly through the crusted snow so there would be no sudden sound. The dog shifted its weight, favoring the injured right front leg, yet it kept its body angled with almost professional discipline, guarding its wounded side against the brush. Luke felt a grim curiosity stir beneath his caution. Most strays did not flank a man, check a cabin's windows, and hold distance like a trained sentry. This dog had not simply survived the wilderness, it had learned strategy somewhere before the wilderness tried to eat it alive. Luke reached the porch without turning his back. Only then did he ease inside the cabin and close the door with the gentleness of a man lowering a sleeping child into a crib. Warmth met him from the dying fire, but his mind remained outside with the starving creature. He stood in the kitchen, hand resting against the counter, listening for claws on wood, for a bark, for the wet silence of retreat. Nothing came. On the wall near the stove hung the satellite phone he had refused to use except for mandatory check-ins. He could call Wildlife Control. He could call the nearest ranger station. He could report an aggressive injured dog near his temporary military cabin and let someone else handle it with cages, tranquilizer darts, and thick gloves. The thought should have comforted him. Instead, it made his stomach tighten. He had seen enough frightened creatures handled by people who mistook control for mercy. He opened the small refrigerator and pulled out a packet of raw venison wrapped in butcher paper from the last town supply run. The meat was dark, cold, and clean in his palm. When he stepped back onto the porch, the dog was still there, now closer to the chopping block, nose working over the air, ribs lifting beneath its filthy coat. Hunger dragged it forward. Memory held it back. Luke crouched on the top step, careful to make himself smaller. He did not smile. Smiles showed teeth, and men had dressed many threats in friendly faces. "You're hungry," he said, as if speaking to a wounded man across a battlefield. "That doesn't mean you owe me anything." He placed the venison on the lowest step and withdrew his hand. Then he backed through the door and closed it, leaving the offering where the dog could take it without surrender. The scramble came almost at once. Claws struck wood. A shadow flashed past the window. Luke stood inside with his hand on the latch and watched through a narrow gap in the curtain. The German shepherd seized the meat, but instead of running, it froze on the step, jaws clamped around the food, eyes locked on the door. Even starving, it would not eat with its back turned. It chewed quickly, violently, swallowed, then retreated to the tree line as if ashamed of needing anything from a man. That, more than the scars, stayed with Luke. The next morning he found no dog on the porch, only blood-flecked snow and a single set of prints leading into the pines. His old routine waited for him like a strict priest. Run, oatmeal, weapon maintenance, wood. But now something lived at the edge of that routine, a dark question with amber eyes. Luke ran his 5 miles through shin-deep snow, his breath burning, his left hand trembling less by the 3rd mile. He returned, cut another strip of venison, and placed it on a flat rock 20 feet from the trees. Then he walked away. The dog appeared only after Luke had resumed chopping wood. It slipped from the pines like smoke from a battlefield fire, head low, tail stiff, every bone showing under the matted black and tan coat. It smelled the meat, stared at Luke, and waited. Luke raised the axe, split a log, and pretended not to watch. The dog took the meat and vanished. On the 2nd day, he placed the food 3 feet closer to the cabin. On the 3rd, 3 feet closer again. A funny thing happened during those days, though Luke would not have called it funny in front of anyone. His schedule, once built to keep ghosts out, began making room for a living creature. He still woke before dawn, still ran until his lungs hurt, still cleaned gear that needed no cleaning, but now he saved meat scraps in a tin bowl and checked the tree line before checking the weather. He began speaking, not because he expected an answer, but because silence had become too crowded with the dead. "You're stubborn," he said on the 3rd afternoon, sitting on the porch with his elbows on his knees while the dog watched from the pines. "That makes 2 of us." The shepherd's ears twitched. Luke studied it in the pale light. The dog was male, large-framed despite starvation, probably 4 or 5 years old, with a deep chest, long legs, and the remnants of a powerful working build. Under the dirt and dried blood, there was dignity in him, the ruined dignity of a fallen knight still refusing to kneel. His eyes were not wild. They were tired, suspicious, and terribly intelligent. Luke had known men with that same look, men who laughed too loudly in bars after deployment because quiet rooms frightened them. "Shadow," Luke said suddenly. The name left his mouth before he waited. The dog stiffened. "Yeah," Luke continued, voice low. "That fits. You stand where the light can't reach, but you're always there." Shadow did not come closer, but he did not leave. That was enough. By the 4th day, Shadow stopped disappearing immediately after feeding. He lingered at the tree line, half hidden behind a ponderosa trunk, watching Luke stack wood. Once, when Luke dropped a log and the sound cracked like a rifle shot, the dog dropped flat to the snow before Luke's own pulse had finished spiking. Not fear alone, Luke realized. Conditioning. The dog recovered fast, scanning left, then right, then back to Luke. A civilian pet would have bolted. Shadow searched for the source of fire. Luke's throat tightened with recognition. "Who made you like this?" he whispered. Shadow only stared back, and in that stare Luke felt an accusation older than words. Humans had made him useful, then humans had made him afraid. Late that afternoon, the wind sharpened. Clouds rolled over the ridges, low and iron dark. Luke carried a larger piece of meat to the bottom of the porch steps and sat on the 2nd step from the top. He held the food loosely in one hand and rested the other palm open on his knee. "Come on, Shadow." The dog emerged slowly. His wounded paw barely pressed the snow. 10 feet, then 8, then 5. He stopped at the base of the steps, trembling with cold and distrust. Luke did not reach. He did not coax. He simply waited, though waiting scraped against every broken part of him. Shadow climbed one step. The wood creaked. Both of them held still. Then the dog stretched his neck forward, not to bite the meat, but to smell Luke's bare knuckles. His nose was icy and wet against the skin. Luke felt the faintest brush of breath, the animal reading him in a language no man could fake. At last, Shadow took the meat gently. His teeth grazed Luke's fingers without pressure. No violence, no surrender either. Just a narrow bridge laid across a canyon. When the food was gone, Shadow remained on the step, close enough for Luke to see snowflakes melting on the old scar across his muzzle. Luke slowly turned his hand palm up, stopping an inch from the dog's neck. The choice belonged to Shadow. For several long seconds, the shepherd stood rigid. Then, with the gravity of a king granting peace after a long war, he leaned forward and pressed his scarred head into Luke's open hand. Luke did not smile. He only bowed his head slightly, because some victories were too sacred for noise. The storm gathered above them, dark and waiting, while man and dog remained on the porch, neither healed, neither safe, but no longer entirely alone. The storm arrived before sunset, not as falling snow, but as a siege. By late afternoon, the Bitterroot Valley had vanished behind a wall of white, and the tall pines around Luke Bennett's cabin bent under the wind like old men bowing before an angry winter god. Luke stood inside the cabin with one hand resting on the doorframe, watching Shadow through the frosted glass. The German shepherd lay curled at the far end of the porch, pressed against the corner where the roof blocked some of the snow. His black and tan coat was dusted white, his body shaking in hard little waves that no amount of pride could hide. He had eaten from Luke's hand only hours before, had even pressed his scarred head into Luke's palm, but trust was not a door that opened all at once. For a wounded creature, trust was a battlefield crossed inch by inch, and sometimes the last inch was the most terrifying. Luke could have gone outside, lifted the dog, and carried him in. He had the strength for it. At 6'2", with a broad chest, powerful arms, and the compact endurance of a man shaped by years of military discipline, Luke could have forced mercy on almost anything smaller than himself. But force had already ruined enough lives. So he did not call Shadow's name. He did not whistle. He did not clap his hands or soften his voice into the sweet nonsense people used for pets. He simply opened the cabin door and walked away from it. Warmth spilled out across the threshold. Firelight rolled over the wooden floor in orange waves. The smell of burning oak, black coffee, wool blankets, and old pine boards drifted into the freezing air. Luke sat in the worn armchair near the hearth, elbows on his knees, hands open, eyes lowered. He made himself still. The open door let the storm push into the cabin, scattering flakes across the rug and stealing heat from the room, but Luke waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Shadow lifted his head. His amber eyes reflected the fire like two small lanterns found in the ruins of a church. He stared into the cabin, not at the warmth first, but at the corners, the windows, the shadows under the table, the space beneath Luke's cot. Even half-starved and half-frozen, he was clearing the room. Luke noticed every movement. The dog's nose worked the air. His ears shifted independently, listening for hidden danger. At last, Shadow rose. His injured right paw touched the boards, then lifted again. He limped to the doorway and stopped with his front feet just outside and his breath fogging in the warmer air. The wild part of him still belonged to the storm. The broken part of him wanted the fire. Luke did not move. Shadow took one step inside, then another. The floor creaked beneath his weight, and he froze, teeth showing for half a second before he realized nothing had attacked him. Slowly, painfully, He crossed the threshold. Luke rose only when the dog was fully inside. He walked around Shadow in a wide half-circle, closed the door, and turned the latch gently. The storm became a muffled roar behind the walls. Shadow flinched at the click, then lowered his head and limped toward the hearth. He collapsed on the thick rug with a sound too tired to be called a sigh. Luke gave him several minutes with the fire. Then he went to the cabinet above the wash basin and took down his military medical kit, a hard green case scratched from deployments and marked with faded tape. When he returned, Shadow's eyes followed the case with suspicion. "I know," Luke said quietly. "People with tools usually mean trouble." He sat cross-legged 3 feet away, opened the kit slowly, and laid everything out where the dog could see it. Clean gauze, antiseptic, tweezers, a small pair of scissors, a towel, and a bowl of warm water. Shadow's lip lifted. Luke stopped. He waited until the growl faded, then dipped the towel into the water. "Your choice," he murmured. "But that paw's going bad." Shadow stared at him with the exhausted fury of a soldier who had been told to hold a position long after reinforcements stopped coming. Then, inch by inch, he dragged himself closer. Luke began with the paw. The fur around it was clotted with dirt and ice. When he touched the swollen pad, Shadow jerked back and snapped his teeth near Luke's wrist, not biting, only warning. Luke did not punish him. He did not even pull away fast. He froze, waited, then tried again with slower hands. This time, Shadow trembled but allowed it. Luke cleaned away the mud and blood until he found the problem. A thin splinter of dark wood buried deep between the pads. "There you are," Luke whispered. With the tweezers, he gripped the splinter and pulled it free. Shadow whined low, a raw sound that seemed to come from years rather than from one wound, but he did not bite. Luke cleaned the cut with antiseptic. The dog's muscles quivered beneath his ruined fur. Next came the raw patch on his left side, where skin showed red and blistered beneath missing hair. Luke cut away a few matted clumps, washed the wound, and covered it lightly. He worked with the careful focus he had once used on injured teammates under gunfire, when panic was a luxury and gentleness had to move quickly. As he cleaned the old scar across Shadow's snout, his thumb paused near the jagged line. Someone or something had left that mark with violence. Luke felt anger rise in him, cold and precise, but Shadow looked up at that moment and the anger softened into something more dangerous. Grief. "You made it this far," Luke said. "That counts." When the wounds were dressed, Shadow did not crawl away. He lowered his head onto Luke's boot and closed his eyes. The gesture was small, almost accidental, but it struck Luke harder than praise ever had. He cleaned the supplies, banked the fire, and turned off the cabin's main light, leaving only the hearth to paint the room in gold and shadow. Later, Luke lay on his narrow cot fully dressed, one arm over his chest, listening to the storm and the dog's breathing. For the first time in weeks, the cabin did not feel empty. Sleep came quietly, then turned traitor. The helicopter returned. Blades hammered the sky. Dust filled his mouth. Someone shouted his name through a radio, drowned in static. Luke saw the flash again, white and merciless. He reached for a teammate's harness and caught nothing but smoke. "No," he rasped, twisting on the cot. "Grab the line." His left hand clawed at the blanket. His chest seized. The cabin disappeared. Montana vanished. He was back in the burning dark, young men screaming through comms, the world splitting open beneath them. Then a weight struck his chest. Not an enemy, not debris. Warm breath flooded his face. A rough tongue dragged across his cheek. Shadow stood over him, front paws planted carefully on his torso, scarred snout pressed against Luke's jaw. The dog whined in a low, steady rhythm, not frightened by Luke's thrashing, not fleeing from the storm inside the man. Luke's eyes snapped open. The cabin returned piece by piece, the rafters, the fire, the snow tapping the window, the dog above him like a loyal guardian dragged from some ancient legend. Luke sucked in one breath, then another. His right hand rose slowly and found Shadow's neck. Fur, heat, pulse, real. "I'm here," Luke whispered, though he was not sure whether he spoke to the dog or to himself. Shadow lowered his body across Luke's chest for a moment longer, pinning him gently to the present. When Luke's breathing steadied, the dog stepped down, circled once at the foot of the cot, and lay across Luke's boots. The storm raged outside, shaking the cabin walls, but Luke did not reach for a weapon. For the first time in months, he woke from war and found a living soul waiting there to bring him home. The fire had burned lower by the time Luke Bennett opened his eyes again, and for several seconds he did not know what had woken him. The cabin was dark except for the red pulse of embers in the stone hearth, and the storm outside had grown into something less like weather and more like a living beast dragging its claws across the roof. Wind slammed against the log walls. Snow hissed through tiny cracks around the window frames. The world beyond the cabin had disappeared, swallowed by a white darkness so complete it felt older than memory. Luke lay still on the narrow cot, boots still on, one hand resting over his chest where Shadow had pressed him back into the present only hours earlier. For the first time in months, he had slept without reaching for a weapon. That should have felt like victory. Instead, the silence inside the cabin felt strange, as if peace had entered wearing borrowed clothes. He turned his head. Shadow was no longer at the foot of the cot. The German Shepherd stood near the front door, body rigid, ears high, scarred snout pointed toward the bottom crack where the wind pushed powdery snow onto the floor. Firelight caught the old wound across his muzzle and made it look like a silver seam stitched by some cruel god. His injured paw hovered slightly above the boards, but pain seemed to have vanished from his mind. Every line of him was alert. Luke sat up slowly. "Shadow?" The dog did not look back. Earlier that evening, after dragging Luke out of the nightmare, Shadow had not slept like an exhausted stray. He had patrolled. Luke had watched through half-closed eyes as the dog moved from the front door to the kitchen door, from the kitchen door to the windows, from the windows to the dark corners near the stacked firewood. He sniffed low, paused, listened, then moved on. It was not random anxiety. It was pattern, a perimeter check. Once, Shadow had even positioned himself between Luke's cot and the entrance, lying with his chest facing the door, as though the man behind him were not a temporary provider of food, but an assigned responsibility. Luke had told himself not to overthink it. The storm, the trauma, the dog's scars, everything invited imagination. But now, watching that wounded animal stand like a sentry carved from shadow and bone, Luke felt the old tactical part of his mind rise fully awake. Something had changed. He eased off the cot without letting the boards creak. The thermometer nailed beside the pantry read 12 below, and that was inside the cabin near a dying fire. Outside, with wind chill, the cold would cut skin like broken glass. Luke crossed the room barefoot silent despite his boots, moving with the old discipline that never left men like him even when peace tried to claim them. Shadow suddenly barked. It was not the hoarse, defensive growl Luke had first heard in the brush. It was sharp, deep, commanding, a single alarm that struck the cabin walls and came back larger. Then another, then a third. "Quiet," Luke whispered automatically, but Shadow ignored him. The dog lunged sideways, grabbed Luke's pant leg in his teeth, and pulled toward the door with shocking force. Not a bite, a command. Luke planted one hand against the wall to keep balance. "Easy." Shadow released the fabric, barked again, then shoved his nose against the crack beneath the door. His amber eyes flashed up at Luke, bright and furious, as if the man were being stupid on purpose. It was absurd, almost funny, and for one brief heartbeat Luke nearly laughed. He had followed orders from admirals, chiefs, and men with medals heavy enough to tilt their spines, but here he was being bullied by a half-starved shepherd with bandaged paws and the manners of a grumpy old sergeant. The humor vanished when Shadow whined. That sound was different, urgent, pleading. Luke knelt and pressed his ear to the cold wood. At first, there was only the storm, a roaring wall of sound that flattened everything beneath it. The wind shrieked through the trees, snapped branches, hurled snow against the cabin in hard bursts. Luke closed his eyes, slowing his breathing, separating layers of noise the way he had once separated battlefield chaos: wind above, roof vibration, branch impact, loose shutter, fire settling behind him. Nothing. He waited. Shadow trembled beside him, not from fear now, but from impatience. Then the wind shifted. For less than a second, the roar dipped, and through that tiny tear in the storm came a sound so faint Luke might have imagined it if Shadow had not heard it first. A car horn. Far away, thin, repeating, then gone. Luke lifted his head. His body had gone cold in a way the weather could not explain. No one should be driving these roads tonight. The nearest maintained route was miles below the cabin, and even that would be buried by now. Most locals knew better than to challenge a Bitterroot blizzard after dark. Tourists did not always know better. Families sometimes trusted GPS more than mountains. A wrong turn, a hidden ravine, ice under powder, and suddenly a warm vehicle became a coffin with headlights. Shadow barked again, then paced in a tight circle, limping hard but refusing to slow. Luke stood. His first thought was not heroic. It was calculation. Visibility nearly zero. Temperature lethal. Terrain unstable. No radio signal. The local station had dissolved into static before midnight, and the satellite phone had only enough charge for one serious emergency transmission. Going out could mean dying within sight of his own cabin. He looked toward the window, where snow had climbed halfway up the glass. The dark reflection staring back at him looked older than 34. For 2 weeks, he had been sent here because commanders and doctors believed isolation might put him back together. Yet, isolation had only taught him how loud a broken mind could be. Now, something beyond those walls was calling, and the call had come through a dog that should have been too wounded to care. Luke moved to the supply trunk at the foot of the cot. His hands did not shake. That startled him. He pulled on thermal gloves, then heavier outer gloves, buckled his snow gaiters, and shrugged into a dark winter parka lined with fleece. He wound a scarf around his lower face, pulled snow goggles onto his forehead, and checked the batteries in a chest-mounted flashlight. The beam flared white across the room. Shadow watched every motion, ears forward, tail low but steady. Luke opened a metal gear case and removed a coil of climbing rope, 2 carabiners, a compact trauma kit, emergency blankets, a flare, and a folding shovel. He packed with swift precision, but beneath that precision something old stirred. Not the nightmare this time, not the helpless reaching through smoke, but the part of him that had once known exactly what to do when other people were lost in the dark. He clipped the knife to his belt, slung the rope over his shoulder, and paused near the hearth. For a moment, his gaze landed on the empty space by the fire where Shadow had first collapsed only hours ago. This dog had been freezing, starving, injured, and betrayed by the world, yet when a stranger cried out somewhere in the storm, he had chosen duty over safety. Luke felt a pressure in his chest that was almost pain. "You hear them, don't you?" he said. Shadow's answer was a low, urgent whine. Luke crossed to the door and gripped the latch. The wood shook under the wind's fists. When he pulled it open, the storm burst in like an invading army, throwing snow across the floor, killing what little warmth remained near the threshold. Shadow pushed forward, but Luke caught him lightly by the collar of fur at his neck. "You stay close. You don't run blind." The dog looked back at him, amber eyes alive with fierce intelligence. For the first time, Luke had the strange sense that Shadow understood not the words, perhaps, but the order beneath them. Man and dog stood at the edge of the white hell together, both scarred, both half-healed, both summoned by a sound too small for the storm to bury. Luke lowered his goggles over his eyes, clicked on the flashlight, and stepped into the blizzard. "Lead the way, buddy." Shadow plunged into the blizzard as if the storm had called him by a name only he could hear. Luke Bennett followed close behind, one gloved hand gripping the rope coil across his shoulder, the other steadying the chest-mounted flashlight that cut a weak tunnel through the white madness. The world beyond the cabin was no longer the Montana forest he had studied during morning runs. It had become a frozen battlefield without gunfire, a place where every pine tree appeared and vanished like a ghost, where the wind shoved against his chest with the rude confidence of an enemy twice his size. Shadow moved ahead with his nose low, injured paw striking the snow in uneven rhythm, yet he did not wander or panic. He chose the shallowest drifts, skirted fallen branches, and paused at every shift in the wind as if reading invisible orders written in scent. Luke had followed point men through worse places, men with rifles and radios and maps marked in red. Never had he placed this much trust in a starving dog he had known less than a week. The thought should have seemed ridiculous. Instead, it felt strangely right, as if some ancient hand had placed both of them in the storm and whispered, "Now walk." They pushed through the pines for nearly 20 minutes before Shadow stopped so suddenly Luke almost crashed into him. The dog stood at the edge of a steep drop, shoulders tense, ears forward, barking down into a darkness that swallowed sound. Luke dropped to his stomach and crawled the last few feet, spreading his weight carefully over the snow crust. He knew this ravine. In daylight, it cut through the valley like a scar left by some giant blade, 50 feet deep with jagged stone walls and a creek frozen beneath layers of ice. In summer, hikers photographed it. In winter, it waited politely for mistakes. Luke unclipped his flashlight and aimed the beam downward. At first, he saw only snow spinning in the air. Then the light caught metal. A dark SUV lay upside down at the bottom of the ravine, half buried in a drift, its roof crushed inward. 4 wheels pointed toward the storm like the legs of a dead beetle. The horn had stopped. That silence was worse than any alarm. Thin, gray smoke curled from the smashed engine compartment and vanished in the wind. "Damn it," Luke breathed. Shadow barked once more, not fearfully, but with the hard insistence of a sentry reporting contact. Luke backed from the edge and found a thick ponderosa pine rooted several feet from the drop. He looped the rope around the trunk, tied a fast tactical knot, pulled until the bark groaned, then clipped the other end to his harness. His hands worked without hesitation. The old machine inside him, the one war had built and grief had failed to dismantle, came alive with purpose. "Stay," he told Shadow. The dog's amber eyes flashed through the snow. Luke stepped backward over the ledge and descended into the ravine, boots scraping rock beneath the powder, rope biting into his gloves. The wind tried to peel him off the cliff. Snow slapped his goggles. Twice his boot slipped on hidden ice, and twice he corrected without wasting breath on fear. When he reached the bottom, the cold hit differently. The ravine trapped the air in a deadly bowl. He waded waist-deep through the drift toward the SUV and wiped snow from the shattered rear window. Inside, a little girl no older than 6 shivered upside down in the back seat, held awkwardly by her belt, her small arms wrapped around a soaked brown teddy bear with one missing button eye. She had honey-blonde curls plastered to her forehead, round cheeks pale with cold, and blue eyes too large for her tiny face. Terror had made her silent except for one thin whisper. "Mommy?" In the front passenger seat hung a woman in her early 30s, slender and long-limbed, with fair skin, auburn hair darkened by melted snow and blood, and a narrow, gentle face now streaked with red from a wound above her temple. This was Sarah Collins, though Luke did not know her name yet. Even half-conscious, she kept twisting her head toward the back seat, trying to see her child, because some mothers could be dragged to the edge of death and still reach first for the small life behind them. In the driver's seat was Mark Collins, Sarah's husband, a man in his late 30s with a sturdy build, broad hands, sandy brown hair, and a short beard along a square jaw that looked made more for honest work than comfort. His flannel jacket and cracked knuckles suggested a man used to fixing things himself, perhaps a contractor or ranch mechanic, the kind of father who probably believed he could get his family home before the storm worsened. Now he hung unconscious against the seatbelt, his face gray, legs pinned beneath the bent steering column. Luke forced his voice calm. "I'm getting you out." Lily blinked at him through tears. "Is my mom dead?" The question struck Luke harder than the cold. "No," he said firmly. "She's fighting. So are you." He smashed the remaining glass from the rear window with the butt of his knife, cleared the jagged edges with his boot, and crawled halfway inside. The vehicle smelled of antifreeze, blood, wet upholstery, and fear. He cut Lily's belt first, catching her before she fell, then pulled her through the broken window into the storm. She was shockingly light, a bundle of bones, red winter coat, frozen mittens, and trembling breath. The teddy bear remained locked in her fist like a sacred relic from a kinder world. Luke wrapped her in an emergency thermal blanket and looked up toward the ridge. "Shadow!" The German shepherd appeared above, then vanished along the side slope, refusing the dangerous straight drop. A moment later, he scrambled down a narrow animal path, sliding through loose powder, claws digging, wounded paw folding and recovering beneath him. Pain did not stop him. Duty had swallowed pain whole. Luke guided him beside Lily. "Cover!" Shadow obeyed instantly. He curled his large body around the child, pressing his chest and flank against the blanket, laying his scarred head near her boots. Lily, too cold to be afraid, buried her face into the dog's neck. Shadow did not flinch. He became a wall of living warmth between the child and the white world trying to take her. "Good boy," Luke said, and the words came out with a reverence he had not intended. Sarah moaned from the front seat. Luke turned back to the SUV. The snow above them shifted with a deep, muffled groan. He looked up. The overhanging cornice along the ravine wall had cracked in a long, crooked line. Not yet falling, but thinking about it. Luke's pulse steadied into something cold and useful. He crawled through the broken side window toward Sarah, bracing one boot against the ceiling that had become the floor. "Ma'am, I'm Luke. I'm going to cut you loose." Her green eyes fluttered open, unfocused but fierce when they found the child-shaped bundle beside Shadow. "Lily," she whispered. "She's warm. My dog has her." It was an absurd sentence, but Sarah seemed to understand enough to stop fighting him. Luke cut her seatbelt, caught her weight, and dragged her carefully through the window, laying her beside the girl. Blood ran down her cheek, but her hand searched until it found Lily's blanket. Then Luke moved to Mark. The steering column had him trapped like a steel jaw. Luke checked his pulse. Strong, but too slow. "Come on, Mark," he muttered, reading the stitched name on a work jacket patch. "Don't make your girls leave without you." Above them, the ravine wall cracked again, louder this time, a sound like a rifle shot fired by winter itself. Snow sifted down in a fine curtain. Shadow lifted his head and barked once, sharp and urgent. Luke planted his boots, gripped the bent metal, and prepared to free the father while the mountain decided whether to bury them all. The ravine cracked above Luke Bennett like the mountain was grinding its teeth. Snow sifted down over his shoulders, over the overturned SUV, over Sarah Collins and little Lily huddled beside Shadow, and for one terrible second the whole white world seemed to pause before deciding who it would keep and who it would bury. Luke planted both boots against the crushed frame of the vehicle and drove his shoulder under the bent steering column, pinning Mark Collins in place. Mark hung unconscious, his sandy brown hair clotted with frost and blood, his short beard stiff with ice, his broad worker's hands limp above his head. He looked like the sort of man who had spent years carrying lumber, changing tires, fixing broken pipes, and telling his daughter there was nothing in the dark that could hurt her. Now the dark had him by the legs. Luke gritted his teeth and pushed. Metal groaned. Pain flared through his back, his ribs, his shoulders. Somewhere above, Shadow barked once, sharp and furious, as if commanding winter itself to wait its turn. Luke pushed harder. The bent column shifted half an inch, then an inch. It was not enough for comfort, but enough for survival. He cut Mark's seatbelt, caught the man's weight, and dragged him through the broken window into the snow. Sarah, pale and shaking beneath the thermal blanket, tried to rise when she saw her husband. "Mark," she whispered, her auburn hair plastered to her face, blood dark at her temple. Luke caught her shoulder before she fell. "Save your strength. I've got him." Her green eyes searched his face, desperate, ashamed to need help, terrified of losing the man she had probably argued with that morning over gas, groceries, or whether the road would be safe. That was the cruelty of disaster. It turned ordinary last conversations into sacred relics. Luke secured the rope around Sarah first. She protested weakly, her hand reaching for Lily, but Luke leaned close and spoke with the low firmness he had once used under enemy fire. "Your daughter needs you alive at the top." That reached her. She nodded once, tears freezing at her lashes. Luke clipped the rope to her improvised harness and climbed ahead, bracing himself against the ravine wall, pulling hand over hand. The climb was ugly, brutal, without grace. Snow filled his collar, ice cut under his gloves. Sarah slipped twice, crying out the second time as her injured head struck his shoulder, but Luke hauled her upward until they reached the rim. He rolled her onto the snow beside the anchored pine, then slid back over the edge without allowing himself more than one breath. Mark came next. Getting an unconscious man up a 50-foot ravine in a blizzard was not rescue. It was war against weight, weather, and time. Luke strapped Mark against his own back with rope and a torn section of SUV seatbelt, then began to climb. Every few feet, his boots lost purchase. Every pull sent fire through his arms. Mark's dead weight dragged him backward, threatening to peel them both from the rock. Halfway up, Luke's left hand trembled, the old tremor returning like a mocking ghost. He stared at the rope, at the white emptiness beneath him, and for a heartbeat he was not in Montana. He was beneath Rotor Wash again, reaching for a man falling away through smoke. Then Shadow barked from below, a deep, commanding sound that cut through memory like a blade. Luke came back. "Not this time," he growled. He drove one knee into the snow wall, pulled until something in his shoulder screamed, and dragged Mark over the rim beside Sarah. He collapsed for 5 seconds, chest heaving, forehead pressed to the snow. 5 seconds was all winter would grant. Lily was still below. When Luke descended again, Shadow stood curled around the child, his scarred body shielding her from the wind. Lily's honey-blonde curls were crusted with ice beneath her hood, and one small mitten still clutched the ruined teddy bear. Her blue eyes fluttered open when Luke knelt. "Is Daddy coming?" she asked, voice thin as thread. "He's waiting up top," Luke said. It was not exactly true, not yet, but hope sometimes had to arrive before proof. He wrapped Lily tighter, secured her to his chest beneath his parka, and checked Shadow with one glance. The German shepherd's injured paw was bleeding through the snow, but his amber eyes remained clear. "Climb," Luke ordered. Shadow did not need a second command. He turned and scrambled up the narrow animal path along the ravine wall, claws biting into ice, body low, wounded leg nearly buckling with every push. Luke climbed the rope behind him with Lily pressed to his chest. The little girl's breath warmed the inside of his coat in fragile bursts. They were 10 feet from the rim when the mountain finally lost patience. A sound split the night, vast and violent, like a cannon fired by God's own hand. The snow cornice above the SUV broke loose. "Move!" Luke shouted, though the word vanished in the roar. Shadow lunged upward, clearing the rim as snow collapsed beneath his hind paws. Luke surged after him, pulling with everything he had left. His gloves slipped, the rope burned. Lily whimpered against his chest. He threw one arm over the edge, dug his elbow into the crust, and rolled sideways just as the ravine exploded beneath them. Tons of packed snow thundered down, swallowing the creek bed, the vehicle, the broken glass, the smoke, the place where they had all been standing less than a minute before. The impact shook the ground under Luke's body. He lay on his back, arms locked around Lily, feeling the avalanche's breath rise from the dark like the exhale of a buried monster. Then Lily cried. It was the most beautiful sound Luke had heard in years. Sarah sobbed from a few feet away, crawling toward her daughter despite her injury. Luke unclipped Lily and placed her into her mother's arms. Mark remained unconscious but breathing, his pulse steady beneath Luke's fingers. Shadow stood near the ravine edge, chest heaving, snow clinging to his ruined fur, staring down at the place the mountain had erased. Luke did not praise him loudly. Some soldiers did not need medals. He touched 2 fingers briefly to the dog's head. "Home," he said. Shadow lowered his nose to the trail they had carved earlier and began moving back through the blizzard. The return took 30 endless minutes. Luke carried Lily when Sarah stumbled, then hauled Mark over his shoulder for the final stretch, each step a bargain with pain. Shadow led without hesitation, finding their old scent beneath fresh snow, circling fallen branches, stopping only when the humans lagged too far behind. At last, the cabin appeared through the white dark, its windows dim, its chimney still breathing a thin line of smoke. Luke kicked the door open and brought them inside one by one. He laid Mark near the hearth, helped Sarah and Lily onto the thick rug, then fed the fire until flames leaped high and gold across the stone. He covered them with every blanket, sleeping bag, and spare coat he owned. Lily, still clutching her bear, reached one hand from beneath the blanket and touched Shadow's ear. "Angel dog," she whispered. Shadow settled beside her without protest. Luke went to the lockbox beneath the cot and pulled out the military emergency beacon, a compact black device he had hoped never to need. His thumb pressed the activation switch. A green light blinked, then blinked again, sending their call into the frozen sky. By morning, the storm had broken. Pale sunlight spilled over the buried valley, turning every branch into glass. At 8 o'clock, the deep thud of helicopter blades rolled across the mountains. Luke stepped onto the porch, exhausted, bruised, and wrapped in smoke-scented cold. For one breath, his body remembered terror. Then Shadow leaned against his leg. Luke looked up as the rescue helicopter descended through the glittering air. This time, the sound of rotors was not a nightmare returning. It was life coming back for them all. The helicopter settled into the clearing like a great orange bird of mercy, its rotors beating the pale Montana morning until snow rose around it in shining clouds. Luke Bennett stood on the porch with one hand resting on Shadow's neck, feeling the dog's pulse under scarred fur while the sound that had once dragged him into nightmares now rolled through the valley like a hymn of rescue. From the cabin behind him came the low voices of medics, the rustle of foil blankets, and Sarah Collins whispering Lily's name as though the child's name itself could keep her alive. The first paramedic through the door was Jenna Morales, a compact woman in her early 40s with warm brown skin, dark hair tucked under a Navy rescue cap, and sharp black eyes that missed nothing. She moved with brisk kindness, the kind earned from years of walking into other people's worst mornings and refusing to be swallowed by them. Her partner, Evan Brooks, was a tall, broad man with a shaved head, a reddish beard, and gentle hands that seemed almost comically careful for someone built like a linebacker. Together they checked Mark's pulse, stabilized Sarah's head wound, and wrapped Lily in heated blankets while the little girl refused to let go of her battered teddy bear. When Jenna knelt beside Lily, the child opened her eyes just enough to point at Shadow. "Angel dog," she whispered. Jenna glanced at the German shepherd, saw the bandaged paw, the old scars, the hollow ribs, and her expression softened. "Looks like he saved more than one soul last night." Luke said nothing. Praise felt too small for what had happened in the ravine. He watched the medics carry Mark out first, then Sarah, then Lily, who lifted one tiny mitten toward Shadow before the wind took her into the helicopter's roar. Sarah turned her pale, bruised face toward Luke from the stretcher. Her auburn hair was tangled around her cheeks, and pain had made her look fragile, but the strength in her eyes remained. "You brought us back," she said. Luke looked down at the dog leaning against his leg. "We did." When the helicopter lifted away, the clearing grew strangely quiet. Not peaceful, exactly. More like the silence after a church bell stops ringing. Snow glittered beneath the new sun. The ravine, hidden beyond the trees, held its secret under tons of ice. Luke had just begun to feel the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones when two snowmobiles growled up from the lower trail. The man who climbed off the first was Sheriff Robert Harris, a 61-year-old local lawman with a square weather-browned face, thick gray eyebrows, and a neatly trimmed white mustache that gave him the look of a retired cavalry officer who had accidentally wandered into the modern age. He was not tall, but he carried himself with rooted steadiness, like an old fence post that had survived every storm because it had learned to bend only when necessary. People in Bitterroot County trusted him because he listened before speaking, and because years earlier he had lost a son to a mountain road accident, a grief that had made him patient with the panic of strangers. His deputy, Nora Pike, was younger, maybe 28, with freckled skin, a long black braid, and a quiet seriousness that suggested she still wrote everything down because she feared missing what mattered. Harris removed his gloves and stepped onto the porch. "Luke Bennett?" Luke nodded. The sheriff looked him over, then glanced at Shadow. "Dispatch says one man, one injured dog, and a whole family pulled out of a ravine in the worst storm we've had in 12 years. That about right?" The dog found them. Harris studied Shadow with new respect. "Then I'll be thanking him, too." Inside the cabin, Harris took Luke's statement while Nora photographed the gear, the blankets, and the bloodied bandages for the report. Shadow sat near the hearth, not asleep, not relaxed, but calmer than he had been when he first crossed the threshold. Every time Harris shifted too quickly, the dog's ears flicked forward. Every time Luke spoke, the dog settled again. At last, Harris nodded toward Shadow. "County protocol. Any stray involved in a rescue, especially one with injuries, we scan for a chip. Could be someone's missing working dog, ranch dog, anything." Luke's hand tightened slightly around his coffee mug. The idea of someone coming to claim Shadow should have been reasonable. Instead, it felt like a door opening beneath his feet. "Move slow," he said. "He's been through enough." Harris approached gently, crouching low, scanner in hand. Shadow stiffened, lip twitching, but Luke gave one quiet command. "Easy." The dog held. The scanner passed over the back of his neck. Once, twice, then it beeped. Harris glanced at the small screen. His face changed. The easy lines around his eyes vanished, replaced by confusion, then disbelief. "That's odd." Luke stood. "What?" Harris tapped the device, then checked the tablet Nora handed him. "This isn't a civilian registry." The cabin seemed to shrink around them. "Read it," Luke said. Harris swallowed. "Department of Defense classification. Naval Special Warfare K-9 unit." Luke's breath stopped halfway into his chest. The sheriff continued, slower now, as if each word were a stone being lowered into deep water. "Service name, Titan." The name struck the room like thunder. Shadow's head snapped up. His ears rose fully for the first time. His tail hit the wooden floor once, hard. Luke could not move. 3 years fell away, and he saw another night, another sky, a black drop over the mountains of Eastern Europe. He saw a military working dog strapped for a jump, powerful, fearless, eyes bright behind protective goggles. He saw wind shear tear the formation apart. He heard shouting over comms. He remembered reaching, missing, watching a dark shape vanish below the clouds. They searched for 5 days. They found shredded gear, broken branches, no body. The report had used clean words. Missing. Presumed killed. The team had used one word only, gone on. Luke looked at the scarred shepherd by the fire. Not Shadow, not a stray. Titan. The K-9 teammate he had mourned without ever being allowed to bury. "Titan," Luke whispered. The dog rose despite his wounded paw and crossed the room with a sound between a whine and a sob. Luke dropped to his knees. Titan pushed his head into Luke's chest so hard it nearly knocked him backward. The tremor that had haunted Luke's left hand went still as his fingers buried themselves in the dog's rough fur. Harris turned away, pretending to study the tablet because some miracles deserved privacy. Luke pressed his forehead to Titan's neck. "Welcome home, soldier." Months later, the Navy officially retired Titan from service and granted Luke permanent custody after medical evaluation proved the dog could no longer deploy but could still live, heal, and love. Mark and Sarah Collins recovered, and Lily sent drawings every few weeks. A scarred German shepherd with wings, a cabin under snow, a tall man holding a leash beneath a yellow sun. Luke kept them on the refrigerator. He did not leave the Navy in bitterness. Instead, he transferred into K-9 training and veteran recovery support, helping other wounded handlers learn that healing sometimes entered quietly, on four paws covered in scars. In the cold valley where winter had once seemed like a curse, Luke and Titan found a home built not from forgetting, but from returning. Two soldiers believed lost to different wars had finally come back to each other. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder, lightning, or a voice from the heavens. Sometimes they come limping through the snow, covered in scars, hungry, afraid, and still brave enough to lead someone else back to life. Luke thought he had been sent to that lonely cabin to be forgotten, but God had placed a wounded dog on the edge of his sorrow to remind him that no soul is ever truly beyond reach. Titan was not just rescued. He became the rescue. And that is how life often works for all of us. The person, animal, or moment we think we are saving may be the very gift sent to save us. So, if your heart feels tired, if your days feel cold, or if you are carrying a grief no one can see, remember this: love can still find you in the storm, loyalty can still return after years of silence, and miracles may be closer than they appear. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, faith, and the quiet miracles that remind us we are never alone. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, healing, and the strength to keep walking through every storm.